Is there a connection between the Star-Spangled Banner and the 9/11 attacks? Occupying Till He Comes at Southwest Prophecy Ministries.
Hello again, friends. This is Dane Rome, your announcer for today's Last Days Beacon program. Thanks for listening, and thanks for joining us. And just a reminder that these programs are supported by your gifts to this ministry. If you'd like to contribute to this ongoing faith ministry, which deals with Bible prophecy and current events, simply go to our website to contribute. Our website address is www.swpm.us. You'll find a donate link on the homepage. The website address again is www.swpm.us. Thank you for your prayers and support for this faith ministry. On today's program, Dr. Dave Schnichter will be interviewing Pauldinger regarding his brand new article entitled The Bizarre Story of the National Anthem. This is our June Last Days Beacon article, and in this article, Paul deals with the true history of the writing of the national anthem. This history includes America's victory over Islamic terrorists in the Barbary War of 1801 to 1805. 200 years after the Islamic terrorists declared war on America, that war was renewed in 2001. The contrast between those two events will be discussed in these podcasts. So, let's join Dr. Schnichter and Pauldinger for today's fascinating discussion.
Thank you, Dane. It is a great privilege to have Pauldinger back on the program today to discuss his brand new article entitled The Bizarre Story of the National Anthem. This article is our June edition of the Last Days Beacon. If you are not a subscriber to the Last Days Beacon, our monthly article, or would like extra copies of this particular article, our announcer will share how to do that at the end of today's program. Paul has been a true friend to me personally and to our ministry. We've had many stimulating conversations regarding American history, and Paul has written several great articles for this ministry. And this month's article is no exception. Paul is a former pastor and magazine editor. He is a serious student of American history and a descendant of a Revolutionary War soldier. Most importantly, he is a born-again Christian who loves the Lord and loves history's great nation. Well, Paul, welcome back to the program today.
Thank you, David.
We began our discussion last week regarding some of the details contained in the content of the Star-Spangled Banner, the national anthem. And we began talking last week about the gigantic flag that is hanging in the Smithsonian National Museum in Washington, D.C. And it is your view that that was not the flag that was flying over Fort McHenry during the night-long British blitzkrieg that occurred in June of 1812. So what are some of the other factors that lead you to that conclusion?
Well, again, this is not my opinion. I'm drawing this from a number of reports from historians, both American, British, and Australian. The flag that's now down at the Smithsonian was ordered in 1813 by the commander of Fort McHenry, and for the purpose to show the British if they were to attack the fort. But when the British did come and attack the fort that night, it was the smaller storm flag that was up, not the flag that's down at the Smithsonian. And again, this is not my opinion. These are documented reports, not just one, but a number of them. There was a British sailor that was on the ship that attacked Fort McHenry, and this soldier wrote a book about what he saw happening, and that was that after the British blitzkrieg, the ships were leaving about 9 in the morning. And he said the storm flag, they saw the storm flag being taken down and this giant flag being put up. So Francis Scott Key did not see this flag, in the dawn's early light. He couldn't have seen it from 8 miles away. But the flag was up there, and apparently Key did see it, but around 9 in the morning.
And that was after the battle was over.
That's correct, yeah.
So the gigantic flag doesn't have any cannon holes in it, as some might surmise.
No, it's the commander took the flag when he retired. Now, this is U.S. property. He took it, stored it in his closet, and then apparently one of his daughters cut parts out of it and gave them away. So that's where the damage came from, not from the War of 1812.
So she used it as souvenirs for her friends.
Apparently, and she also sewed the letter A, apparently, for Armistead in the flag.
So just to recap, so at 9 a.m. after the battle was over, this victory flag, I guess you could say, the gigantic flag, was hoisted, perhaps to thumb their nose at the retreating British, and that is what Francis Scott Key saw as he was being dropped off the ship, since he was on a British ship, probably in the vicinity of this gigantic flag, so he could actually see that, but he wasn't 8 miles distant as he was during the actual attack during the night. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay, good. Well, we've just done a little bit of a correction of, not of American history, but the revisionists that have created a tradition around this gigantic flag. It was not insignificant. It certainly has historical significance, but not in exactly the same sense that most would believe. Paul, in your article, you cite some contrasts between America's victory in the Barbary War, which was declared in 1801, and the Islamic jihadist attack against America, which occurred 200 years later on September 11th, 2001. What are the contrasts that you see?
Well, in 1805, the war was declared in 1801. 1805, the Mid-East was opened because of the American victory over the Barbary pirates for the first time since the Crusades closed it. And this is one of the things that the Pope was so impressed about. And if you fast forward 200 years later, in 2001, which is the 200th anniversary of the starting of the Islamic Jihad against America on the Barbary Coast, it's exactly the opposite. In other words, America was opened to Muslims after 9/11. Muslims were invited in, and essentially, Muslims declared a revival of the Jihad of 1801 on the 200th anniversary of that in 2001. So the situations are completely reversed, and Islamic Jihad has been going on in America on a guerrilla basis, and it's just one of the astonishing reversals, inversions of American history, and nobody seems to recognize that.
You know, it seems to me there's another factor here that since 2001, we've had a great deal of destruction of Christian communities in the Middle East. So the jihad, the Islamic Jihad, has not just been rendered against the West, of course, in America, and we've seen the Western Europe being completely overrun by Islam, to the point where in many European nations you cannot even speak out against Islam without going to prison. And of course, Christian communities have been pretty much wiped out in Iraq and Syria and in other Middle Eastern countries. So in effect, we're seeing the Middle East becoming closed to Christianity, whereas in 1805, with the American victory in the Barbary War, we saw the Middle East becoming open to Western missionary effort and Western enterprises. So to me, that's part of that reversal. So we're seeing a reversal of the victories that were won in the Barbary War, aren't we?
Exactly, Dave. I agree completely with everything that you said. In fact, you've added to what I had written. The Islamic Jihad is going on, but it's now going on in a guerrilla basis. And, you know, it began in America because America's the, you know, I mean, many liberals say America's not a Christian nation. You can't say that to Muslims. They are absolutely convinced it is not just a Christian nation, but the lead Christian nation of the modern world.
So that would, of course, make us a public enemy number one for Islamic jihadists, isn't it?
Absolutely. But the irony here, David, in addition to what we've just said, is that when, you know, you're at a baseball game this summer and you're singing the national anthem, but you're singing really about the victory over Islamic terrorism at the beginning of the 19th century, while Islamic terrorism is going on in a stealth phantom basis in America now.
Yes, absolutely. Some have compared this to the Tet Offensive during the Vietnam War, when North Vietnamese communists snuck into South Vietnam and took positions, you know, of employment, etc. And at a specific point in time, known as the Tet Offensive, the North Viet Cong unitedly and collectively mounted an attack against South Vietnam, which of course was key to their eventual victory. So what you're saying is the placement of Muslim jihadists in America in a quiet manner may at some point become a very active Tet Offensive type of assault on America.
Well, should jihad, and I mean all-out jihad, be called by Muslim leaders in the United States? If you're one of those peaceful, quiet Muslims, you don't have a choice of, oh, well, I'll just stay on the sidelines and it doesn't really matter, you know, I don't want to get involved in the war. You have to get involved in the war. So all the peaceful Muslims will, at that point, be transformed into violent jihadists of one form or another. And, you know, we just have not seen Muslims really express any outrage over the jihadist attacks in America and around the world.
Yes, I have noticed the silence is deafening, whether it be you know, mass murders in a Paris nightclub, or trucks running over dozens and dozens of people in Nice. The Muslim community is strangely silent when these attacks take place. So I think that lends credence to your view that when the call for the jihadist offensive takes place, there will not be any sidelined Muslims at that point in time.
I would guess that in that situation, any Muslim, including women and children, who said something like, "Well, I'm all for peace. You know, I don't believe in war. So you know, I'm not going to get involved in this." I'm guessing they would be shot.
I would think so. Yeah, the Muslim faith is not at all democratic. It's monolithic, and of course, Islam means submission. And of course, that would include submission by professing Islamists as well. Well, in conclusion, let me ask this. I think it's a timely thing as we move toward the celebration of Flag Day this June 14th, 204 years after Francis Scott Key published the Star-Spangled Banner. What are some of the spiritual themes in the national anthem that we need to be reminded of in June of 2018?
Well, number one, David, the most important thing is that America is God's country. It is God's tool in the last phase of history. And for those Americans who hate the flag, who loathe America, they're not just anti-American, they're anti-God and anti-Christ. So that's something to remember. I mean, patriotism is the belief that God formed this country, and that God has empowered this country, and that God protects this country. And when this country begins turning its back on God, this country will end. And the second thing is that the national anthem was really, the sentiments in the national anthem really came from the American victory over Islamic terrorism. And yet today, America's ruling class is empowering Islamic terrorism, inviting Muslims into the country, protecting them, and so there's this irony when you're singing the Star-Spangled Banner, which was about the victory over Islamic terrorism, when Islamic Jihad is going on under the covers in America right now and is building towards a climax. So those are two of the big things. But finally, there's the fact that, and this is a well-established fact, supported by many different facts, if you know authentic American history, the fact that America is prophesied in the Bible. That was believed by the colonists, the American revolutionaries, well into the Civil War and even into the 20th century. So America is so huge in terms of history that Americans really can't grasp it. I would compare, sort of a little illustration that I've used, I would compare Americans to two fleas on the back of an elephant. And the one flea says, wow, this is one big elephant. And the other flea looks up, looks around, and he says, what elephant? And the one that says, what elephant, I would say, constitutes most Americans and their blindness to the gigantic significance of America.
It's a historical blindness. In other words, they're surrounded by the facts and the history of America, but they don't see the significance of it.
I would go as far as to say that America is in a giant delusion. You know, in Paul's second letter to the Thessalonians, he said that God will give a giant delusion. I think that was the very word that's used in the English translation. A giant delusion to Americans, or to people, to Christians, at the end times, those who don't realize that they are close to the end and close to the return of Christ.
I think that's an apt description for many people, that they are under a giant delusion, that they should not believe or receive the truth. And
right.
Hopefully...
Well, you have to read that passage. I mean, when my wife and I read it, it just rings in our ears how much it seems to apply to where we are right now in America.
Oh, I agree. I think that we are in those days. I think they will certainly grow worse, and certainly I believe after the rapture of the church, the entire world will be under strong delusion and ripe for takeover by the Antichrist. and the false prophet, but we are very quickly moving to that level of mind control and delusion and blindness, and certainly in our country today, and I believe much worse in countries where Christianity has even less influence. So these are dark days. We're trying to shine a flashlight, a spotlight on the truth, including the true story of the national anthem, to remind Americans of our really privileged heritage as being part really of history's Protestant nation. As you've pointed out so well in previous articles, we are the first nation that is decidedly a Protestant nation, and the biblical worldview that came out of that is really what birthed our country. And the national anthem is one reflection of that Protestant heritage.
You know, I would put a finer point on where I agree with you about the Protestant heritage and all that, but I would put a finer point on that, and that is that America is the touchstone of biblical Christianity, because everything changed with the Reformation. If you look at the first half of the millennium that just passed, that was divided in half by the Reformation, 1517, a giant historical hinge happened when people started reading the Bible. And the contrast between the last half of the Reformation era, which we've just passed last year, and the first half is night and day. The first half was just a horror show. And when people started reading the Bible, and nowhere more than in America, the modern world came out of that.
Oh, absolutely. It was as if the light turned on and spiritual darkness began to ebb away. And it truly was a reflection of God's working in America. And of course, it was a God-shaped, biblically shaped culture. And as we move away from that, of course, we move back toward darkness, don't we?
Well, we're getting darker and darker.
That's true. Well, Paul, we're out of time for today. Thank you for joining me for both last week and today's fascinating discussion.
Good to talk with you, David.
Well, friends, I'm sure you will want to order multiple copies of our June Last Days Beacon article entitled The Bizarre Story of the National Anthem. It is subtitled, Did You Know That 9/11 and the Star-Spangled Banner Are Connected? Very interesting contents in that regard. And now our announcer, Dane Rome, will share how you can obtain this timely article.
Thank you, Dr. Schnichter. Dear friends, every month, Southwest Prophecy Ministries produces an excellent article entitled The Last Days Beacon. These articles deal with a wide variety of subjects pertaining either to Bible prophecy or Christian liberty. Today's article is entitled The Bizarre Story of the National Anthem. We're offering a complimentary copy of this article to each one who requests it. So simply go to our website, www.swpm.us, and click on the Bookstore tab. Type Last Days Beacon in the Search tab and order your free copy of The Bizarre Story of the National Anthem. You may also order extra copies to share with family and friends. You may order 5 copies for $5, 25 copies for $15, or 100 copies for $60. When you order extra copies, you'll be automatically placed on our mailing list to receive the monthly mailing of the Last Days Beacon. Well, please join us next week for another Last Days Beacon program brought to you by Southwest Prophecy Ministries. And until then, this is Dane Rome, your announcer, saying thanks for listening.